Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. We're very pleased to have you at another session of Discovery. My name is Alison Moswich, and I am the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Calgary, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So before we get started, just a reminder to everyone that our guest speaker today will present for about 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. Please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see a little Q&A button. If you could just put your questions there. And that actually gives you the ability to upvote the questions too. So if you like a question, I can see how many people like that question. And then I can make sure that we prioritize that question in the question and answer period. So we do have a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern time, respecting everyone's busy days and most important meetings, like your lunch. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Jessie Rowe. Jessie is the Executive Director of the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance. So thank you so much, Jessie, for joining us, and I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Allison. And thanks very much to Efficiency Canada for having me today. I'm also coming to you from Calgary, so I appreciate the land acknowledgement that Allison's just gone through. I think always a very important part of gathering and acknowledging where we've come from and hopefully where we're heading as well as a country and as a peoples on this land. So for my topic today, I'm going to be talking about PACE, or Property Assessed Clean Energy, and when it comes to new construction, and in particularly in the residential sector, a project that the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance is currently working on. But I should tell you a little bit about the Alliance. So I'm the Executive Director of the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance. We're a membership-based organization. We've got members that come from municipalities, utilities, post-secondary schools, products and service providers, and other industry associations and nonprofits. Here's a list of our member organizations. And one of the interesting things about our membership is that it is very diverse. There's not necessarily just one reason why organizations have decided to join us as members. And this is annual renewal. So these are the ones that have signed up for 2022, and great to see the list continues to grow. But it is interesting to see that, again, there's a lot of different interests. Some are joining because they want to see greenhouse gas emission reductions. Others are joining because they see economic opportunities or job creation opportunities. Some are joining because, they're part of the energy system and they want to see, the affordability of the energy system take precedence and priority. And certainly helping with, low-income folks and other disadvantaged communities is certainly part of one of the reasons why we have folks joining us as an organization. So great to have this diverse membership as a way to support the work that we're doing. And so as an organization, relatively small organization, we pick and choose a few projects every year, secure some funding for them, hopefully, if they're good enough ideas, and then move forward with trying to make some change, positive change within the province when it comes to the uptake of energy efficiency. And so the one I'm going to talk about today is around Property Assessed Clean Energy. It's one of our two big projects that's currently ongoing. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to go just a little bit of general around what PACE is, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about our project. And so PACE, or Property Assessed Clean Energy, I think most people probably on the call already know about it, but I'll just kind of go through the high level points. And this is how it's working in Alberta currently, is a property owner. And so the programs in Alberta are right now focused on residential, but in the States where PACE originated from was actually commercial properties where it first became popular. So a property owner will decide that they want to do an upgrade project, and they'll work with their contractor to apply for the property type financing. And so the financing, once it's approved, then gets paid out to that contractor once the work is done. And then the key part of PACE is that the repayment of the financing comes on your property tax bill. And the reason in which they created PACE was for this very mechanism of property taxes and improvements that are repaid through property taxes could actually be transferred to a new building owner. And so that's the key element of PACE and the reason why it was created in the first place. They found out afterwards that there's other benefits to this process and approach, but we'll get into some of those a little bit later on. But those are the basics of PACE and why it's a little bit different than what you find when it comes to financing other energy efficiency and renewable energy property type projects. When it comes to PACE in Alberta, we don't actually call it PACE here. We call it Clean Energy Improvement, or Clean Energy Improvement Program, the logo on the right-hand side there. And that's because in 2018, the provincial government put together a legislation that would enable municipalities to use this mechanism. and it was called an Act to Enable Clean Energy Improvements. So from a legal perspective, they are clean energy improvements, not property says clean energy in Alberta, but it's largely the same thing, although we do have some nuances that are specific to Alberta when it comes to that act. With my organization, the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance, we were talking to the provincial government at the time to really encourage them to move forward with this legislation, because we saw it work in other jurisdictions, particularly in the US, and we wanted to unlock that opportunity here in Alberta as well. So when it came to the timeline and the steps, we had 2018, the Act was passed. 2019, a set of regulations was developed and released, which provided more detail in terms of how municipalities could move forward with CEIP, we call it, CEIP, in the province. And at the time, I was actually with Energy Efficiency Alberta, which was a provincial agency set up by the provincial government. And we did a lot of different programs, so incentive programs like you see in other provinces, but we were also building the CEIP program at the time. In 2020, Energy Efficiency Alberta was shut down, but the CEIP program was transferred to what was called at that time the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association, the Association for Municipalities in the province. They've just renamed themselves as Alberta Municipalities. So they're the ones that are leading and actually assigned to be the program administrator for all of the municipalities running programs in the province. And so far, we have 4 programs in the province that are taking in applications right now. The town of Devon and the town of Rocky Mountain House were the first 2 out of the blocks, working on residential programs. City of Edmonton was next with a residential program, which I heard was fully subscribed very quickly in terms of the funding that was available. They're now looking to also launch a commercial program. They're positioning these as pilot programs to test out the program and then to see how they might want to evolve it into a full long-term program. And the city of Leduc, where I was actually born and raised, has just launched a program as well. So that's what's currently happening. And so as an organization, the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance, we're always looking at where do we add value to what's already happening in the province and help us get to the next level when it comes to energy efficiency. On the PACE or CEIP side of things, certainly there was a lot of activity already happening when it came to existing programs, which are focused on existing residential buildings primarily. And that's a great place to start. I mean, that's where the majority of the population is going to be able to access the program. We thought there's lots of cooks in the kitchen on that one. We're not going to be another body in trying to move that forward because there's a lot of activity already. But where could we add value going forward? And from my perspective, when we were developing the program at Energy Efficiency Alberta, and I was involved in that, we were always thinking about how do we design a program that's going to have the administrative costs or the administrative overhead wasn't going to be overly high, because we had heard some other programs, the City of Toronto, for example, that the administration for these programs isn't necessarily as easy as, say, an incentive program, which is very easy to promote, lots of uptake. When we at Energy Efficiency Alberta were launching incentive programs, lots of uptake in those, a lot of pent-up demand. Whereas property type financing is a little different than just getting an incentive for an upgrade. And so we knew there was going to need to be more engagement of the participants, and also more participants who might start the journey but not finish it at the end of the day. You don't see that so much in incentive programs, but in financing programs, certainly that's what we had heard is one of the things that does happen with these types of property type financing, or has happened with these types of property type financing. And so I was always thinking about, well, how do we get to some economies of scale in order to reduce that per project administrative overhead and spread it out over more projects. And one of the things that I thought was a particularly good fit was in new home construction, particularly in Alberta here. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of economies of scale, a lot of repeating of designs. And not only do you get those economies of scale, but you also have a very sophisticated sales force when it comes to selling new homes. And so they are people that build a really strong relationship with a buyer, go into an awful lot of detail. And so talking about the opportunity with property type financing could be one of those things that they add on to their already existing very robust process. And so certainly I thought, just from an individual perspective, there was a lot of opportunity here, but I certainly didn't want to rush forward with anything until we tested this theory a little bit. And so that's where I approached Build Alberta, which is the Home Builders Association in the province. They used to be called the Canadian Home Builders Association Alberta, but have since rebranded as Build Alberta when they combined with the Urban Development Institute here. And so I reached out to Build Alberta and said, do you think this is of interest? And depending on that response, either it was going to be a project or not a project. And so the response was very positive, and I was really encouraged by Build Alberta's response. And so then we went then to some funders. So we've always got to, as a relatively small organization, always got to find some funding for the projects that we do. And so the Alberta Real Estate Foundation was the first one to jump in with some funding. So really appreciate that. And then Alberta Eco Trust was the second, and they've funded us through their Low Carbon Cities Fund, the one that they administer for Edmonton. They administer one for Edmonton and one for Calgary, but we got the funding from the one through Edmonton. So a big thanks to Alberta Eco Trust as well for their contributions. So when we started talking in more detail with Build Alberta, and not just the association, but some of their members, home builders in the province, some very large ones, I continued to ask the question, what is the value that you see when it comes to having property tied financing be used for new home construction? And as we were talking, a number of different ideas came up, and so I've captured some of them here. And I do think they do make a compelling case for why this is a fit for the new construction sector. And so I'll just run through them and see what you think as well from your own perspective, because this is part of the purpose of my project right now, is to actually not just talk within Alberta, but to see what kind of interest there might be across the country. So take each of these as they come and appreciate some feedback on whether you see this as an opportunity in your jurisdiction as well. So the first one that came up was the ability to purchase an upgraded, more energy efficient home for the same sticker price as a standard home. So not just a benefit for a home builder in selling a home, but also a home buyer and being able to buy a home. And certainly, I think we've all heard in the energy efficiency world, the analogy to, oh, it's really hard to sell energy efficiency on a new home, because a lot of times buyers are looking at other upgrades first. So maybe it's more cosmetic upgrades like granite countertops. And so what will end up happening is you'll see a lot of those upgrades being added on until you hit the limit of your mortgage, and then you stop. And that's all you're able to get through and add on. And so certainly the ability to say, hey, there's actually another place that you could be financing these energy efficiency upgrades. Oh, and guess what? This is going to be saving you money on your utility bills over the long run. And so it's actually got a direct return on investment, taking it away from competing with some of those more cosmetic choices or other upgrade choices. I think is a really big opportunity when it comes to this property type financing. The second one that came up, it was really around capacity building within the home building industry. And so certainly we're hearing and have codes being developed nationally that are to be rolled out provincially. We've got some targets for timelines, but in terms of how is the industry going to respond to that? How are they going to get ready for those new code changes? In the past, we've seen, perhaps some hesitancy because, it might be a bit of a jump from what they're doing already. One of the opportunities I see with property type financing is to actually build capacity within the marketplace before new codes are required. And so we've got increased capacity within our trades, within our home builders, and within our supply chains in order to build that capacity prior to code adoption. And I don't know about your province, but certainly in Alberta, one of the things that we've had is when it comes to code adoption, the readiness of industry is actually a really big factor to the speed at which that can happen. And so, we might get into a scenario where hopefully, we can successfully launch and demonstrate property type financing for new construction, and it might actually make it easier for that code adoption to happen at the end of the day. And that's good from both a climate change goals perspective, and as well an affordability perspective. I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is sometimes we put new homes in a special category of, oh, that's just people who with a lot of money, they should be able to do it by themselves. But every new home that's built 10, 15, 20 years from now will probably be on its second buyer at that point. And certainly it's much more affordable to upgrade the homes at time of construction than to do it afterwards. This area really reminds me of a trip I took to part of Calgary that I don't normally go to. It was right on the outskirts. And I was surprised that in this very new community, I think it was less than 10 years ago, it was quite obvious there was a lot of renters that were in that community. And it was actually, quite affordable for them to be living in that community in a relatively new home. But certainly as a renter, they're also going to be faced with, what are the utility bills? And the better we build those buildings to start with, all those buildings, the better it's going to be for all the existing building stock 10 or 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now. And then the last one, certainly we were looking at one of the barriers that one of the builders brought up that we were talking to is they do net zero townhomes. And these are starter homes for people, and they say that their buyers are expecting to live in them from 6 to 8 years. And so when you're talking about a net zero upgrade, that's going to really pay for itself, a simple payback of maybe 10, 15 years. A question comes up, what if I sell before I recover my costs? And so the ability for the repayment of the financing and the benefits of those upgrades to the new buyer is really the reason why PACE was invented in the first place. And so this is something that we're certainly looking at. We looked at a few scenarios where we looked at what kind of upgrades builders would be interested in doing for the townhome area, as well as the single family type developments. And we were looking at opportunities to see if we could get some upgrades that were actually cash flow positive for all future buyers. So the increase in your property taxes would be completely offset, more than offset, by the reduction in your utility bills. And certainly there were some upgrade packages that did pass that. Some of it, to be honest with you, depending on what the price of carbon was, what the price of carbon was on natural gas and through our electricity system as well. But as we move towards more decarbonization, and certainly the numbers we were doing wasn't taking into account any of the price changes that have happened over the last 6 months. Certainly we're in maybe a very different paradigm when it comes to what those potential costs and the potential to recover those costs looks like over the long term. So that brings us to my last slide here. So with this project, once again, I'm looking for some input and some feedback on, do you see this as an opportunity within your municipality, within your region? That's the question we've been posing to some municipalities in Alberta here. Definitely got some good feedback on that. I'm going to go through a bit of that feedback, but I'm very interested in your thoughts on what the opportunity is perhaps in your province as well. So when it came to feedback from municipalities and the program administrator here in Alberta, the first thing that everybody said is, well, we're very busy on launching our existing homes program. And so that's our current focus and priority. And I think that's totally understandable. That's where the majority of the population, can access these programs, a great place to focus. What we're working on is really, how do we start doing some of the groundwork that would be required for a new home program to come after those existing home programs are launched and operating more in a business as usual environment. The next thing we heard was certainly some of the program rules, the bylaws, and even the legislation here in Alberta wasn't necessarily written with new construction in mind. And so we've been taking a look at all of those and seeing how they would need to be adapted. They're relatively modest adaptations, but as we all know, that sometimes legislation isn't the easiest thing to change. But I do think if we see benefit from both a municipality and a home builder perspective, that we should be able to find a way to adapt those rules, bylaws, and legislation to enable a new construction to be part of these programs. But the biggest one that really came up for me as we went through, and I wasn't expecting it at all, was the program funding model that's currently being used. So I think a lot of people on the call are probably aware that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has a fund to fund property type financing programs and other efficiency financing programs supporting through municipalities. And the programs in Alberta are all accessing FCM funding of one form or another to support their programs. And that's really enabled them to come forward with interest rates that are quite attractive. And so we see that happening with existing homes through FCM. We also see the Canadian Infrastructure Bank supporting some low interest financing for commercial building upgrades on existing commercial buildings. And seeing that certainly when it comes to a new home program, that would be one of the elements that we'd be very interested in exploring as well to enable successful program uptake on the new home side as well. And so this is where I went from thinking about this as an Alberta focused program to thinking about it more broadly than that. Because of course, when it comes to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, all of that funding comes from the federal government at the end of the day. And so I think there is an opportunity and something we should be seriously thinking about is actually engaging with the federal government and more of a national conversation. So I've been talking with Build Alberta, the Provincial Home Builder Association, broadening that, been talking to them about broadening that to the Home Builder Association, the Canadian Home Builder Association, the national organization. I certainly would love to engage Federation of Canadian Municipalities in that conversation, and municipalities directly that are across the country in a conversation about this, to see whether there is enough interest across the country to be approaching the federal government to say, you've been doing a great job on those existing buildings, commercial and residential, through the funding you've already done. What we should be thinking about next is how do we support new construction as a way to build capacity for the code changes that we're hoping to move forward at a national level through all of the provinces. So that's one of the things I'd really like to get some feedback on today. Very interested to see who might be interested from a municipality or other type of organization perspective to join a conversation that we can have just to see what kind of interest there is across the province. So happy to take any questions there might be. I'm also looking for feedback, so happy to hear any feedback there might be. And there's an email address. I'm really particularly interested in who would like to be part of an ongoing conversation. So please send me an email at that email address, contact@aea.ca, if you're interested in continuing a conversation on this.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jesse. That was going to be my first question is you've said feedback a couple times now. So where are people directing all of this? Because I'm seeing lots of comments in the background.
Did I say that enough?
I don't know. You can always say it one more time.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation. That is a really interesting jump from Alberta to federally, and I think that's a conversation that we could certainly start to have. So we do have quite a few really good questions, and I'm excited to ask you some of these because they're really, it seems like we've got a really well-educated audience on Pace, unsurprisingly, but it's generated some really cool questions. So I'll just remind people that as you're adding new questions to the ones that we already have, our only rule is no sales pitches. I haven't seen any yet, so you're all killing it today. Okay, so let's get going with some of the questions. So we have one about barriers to Pace. So, I know we've actually got some people on the call today. We've got some people from EcoTrust. We've got some people from the SEEP program in Alberta. So put your hands up if you want to maybe jump in. But Jesse, let's give you the opportunity to answer this one. So have you seen any reluctance from buyers with homes that have Pace obligations? So I think we've been targeting a lot of people, a lot of homeowners to participate in Pace, but what's the feedback been from people that are looking to buy a house that has already had these retrofits and it now has this obligation?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm going to caveat all of my responses with the fact that I am not the most knowledgeable person on Pace across the country. There are some folks that have been working on this much more than I have that will be able to offer more insights than I do. I'm really just focusing on this new construction opportunity. So I'm going to be answering some of these questions just based on my own limited knowledge and experience, and others can certainly provide some feedback in the chat if I've gotten anything wrong or if you'd like to add some more detail. From what I've heard, certainly on the residential side of things, transferring a property with a property type financing on it, a lot of times what you'll see is the buyer will request that the seller actually pay off that financing before the sale is transferred. And so that's certainly one of the options with property type financing. The legislation here in Alberta, it's required for that property type financing to be disclosed when you're doing the sale, even as you're advertising it. And so I think disclosure is incredibly important. But I do think we're going to be entering an era where people are going to be thinking about these types of upgrades differently than they have in the past. I've been working on energy efficiency and climate change issues for over 20 years now. And the amount of awareness and interest there is in this topic now compared to, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago when, we have these examples of people saying, no, I don't want this loan. You got to pay it off before I transfer it. I mean, electric vehicles, just seeing the change in there. I could certainly see us getting to a scenario where people say, hey, you've got a net zero energy home. That's pretty cool. This is different than the 12 other homes I've been looking at. I'm interested in that new technology, and I'm interested in this financing that you've used. We saw with the City of Edmonton program, it was fully subscribed. I think it was in 45 minutes. And so I think we are going to see a different dynamic when it comes to the market acceptance of this. But when it comes down to it, no matter the acceptance of that buyer, there are options for the seller to either take care of that and conduct their sale with it not on the property, or to have it go through the sale as well. So I think that optionality is really important.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jesse. So I think this is a good follow-up question to that question. So for a new home, do you have a sense or have you seen any examples of how municipalities estimate the portion of the cost that's attributable to lower energy use? So like how much to actually finance through Pace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that would need to be figured out. Some of our initial conversations have been doing a bit of brainstorming where, Jamin is one of the big home builders in the province. They've already have broken out the cost of their standard home versus the cost of the upgraded higher efficiency home. And they've got different levels that you can go to all the way to net zero. And so they've already taken that approach of breaking out what that additional upgrade cost is. And most of our home builders do that as well. They've got their base model and they've got their higher efficiency model. And so from a program administration perspective, I would suggest that at the very least, a program administrator, we need to say, we're not paying for anything that is required by code. And so anything that you would build in terms of a base model house, that's not eligible. We're only looking for what's above and beyond code or your base model. And the home builders that we've been talking to, already use that as a standard practice. So again, these things still need to be worked through in terms of, actually putting the dots on the I's and crossing the T's. But I do think there is a pathway to really identify, what is that upgrade amount. We've also got some home builders saying that, the limit on the PACE financing in Alberta for residential properties is $50,000 per property. And so some of those are saying, for some of our single family homes to get to net zero, it actually costs more than $50,000. And so they're saying, well, maybe it's just a portion of the upgrade that gets attached to the property taxes, and the rest of the upgrade gets paid through your normal mortgage or the normal way you're paying or financing for your home. So things to be worked out, but certainly there's some good options that we've discovered so far.
And that's an excellent segue into some of the other questions that we have had. So we've got a couple questions about what PACE financing can actually be used to supplement. So is it the entire project? Are there limitations? And maybe you can just address, so, I think there's the legislation that enables the PACE financing, but then there's also what the municipality puts in place. So maybe you can talk a little bit about where the certain limitations would exist and what parties could set them, and then some of the other ones that you might have seen.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So yeah, we've got an act, we've got regulation, we've got a bylaw from the municipal perspective, and we've got the program rules that all define what can be financed. And so there's lots of layers to ensure that we're financing the right things, and that there's some consumer protection around it as well. But when it comes down to it, it's the program rules that take all of those things into account. The program rules have to follow the legislation and the bylaws that govern the program itself. And so I think the team at the Clean Energy Improvement Program here in Alberta has done a really great job of boiling that down into practically what can you do on your property. And so if you go to their website for the Clean Energy Improvement Program, I believe it's myceip.ca. You can just Google Clean Energy Improvement Program. I'm sure you'll find it. They make it really easy for the homeowner to see all of the different upgrade opportunities that would fit into the program. And it's not a surprising list. It's a very similar list to what you see for an incentive program. You've got HVAC, you've got envelope, some of the other measures out there, insulation, those types of things. So it's actually solar is another one as well, I should mention. It's actually a pretty predictable list that they've been able to identify as upgrades that could be done within the legislation. And looking at that list, I was looking at that list with the new home builders. They were looking at that list and saying, well, that's what we do for our upgrade packages as well. And so I would see actually the upgrades would be very similar to what the SEEP program has already identified.
Standard list, but no less exciting.
It's really exciting sometimes, but sometimes it's actually kind of boring, but that's where the magic is.
You got to find the sweet spot. Okay, so Chris has a question about some of the different road bumps, and through kind of what you're learning, what are you looking at? So, he's saying PACE is a great program. It's had road bumps in other locations. And then just wondering if you could talk a bit more about consumer protection and fraud prevention, what that's looked like in other locations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the biggest black eye that PACE has in the States is programs out of California, where you've got people selling furnace replacements with absolutely terrible contracts associated with them. The home buyer isn't fully informed, and they're signing on to things that are way more expensive than they need to be. And PACE is just a financing mechanism that's tied to this, broader, unethical practices, as far as I could tell. Now, that isn't unique to PACE. We've seen in some places in Canada and other parts of the United States where people are being signed up for, say, hot water heater leasing contracts, or other contracts that are just not good contracts. I mean, nobody should be selling this garbage because it's way more expensive, and it's almost impossible to get out of as well. So it's not unique to PACE, but it happens in other areas as well. Now, one of the things that's different about the program in California versus other PACE programs across the States is that really focused on the residential sector, and there was a lot of furnace replacements. Whereas PACE in the States for 10 years was really very commercial focused. So you got a very sophisticated audience associated with it. The other difference between PACE in the States and where we've seen some of these unethical practices and what's happening in Alberta is in the States, PACE can be financed through third parties, private sector financing. Whereas the way the legislation is written in Alberta, it can only be financed through municipalities. And so you don't have the same kind of private sector interest trying to, squeeze as much as they can out of this financing mechanism. Now that's got its pros and cons, right? So you might not have the same unethical actors in the marketplace, but what we've seen in the States is that when you do have a good program, and say in the commercial sector that's operating ethically, that private sector financing can actually drive a lot of good projects. And so that's one of the things that certainly is a barrier here in Alberta right now. I do hope we find a way to overcome that at some point, but it is what it is. So there is some certainly inherent consumer protection built in Alberta that wasn't existing in those examples in the States and California. And I haven't heard of any other, the questionable practices in other Canadian programs either. So I think that's a very big black eye, but it's also, limited, I believe, just to one state.
And always offers good learning opportunities for other jurisdictions.
Yeah, lots of good ideas on what not to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the next question is about PACE financing and just the level of demand we're seeing for it so far. So what do you think needs to be done to increase the capital pool available for PACE programs? And just to comment that so far all the introductions seem to get oversubscribed within a matter of days, and in your case, Jesse, a matter of minutes. So can you talk a little bit about additional financing for PACE programs?
Yeah, a good problem to have, I think. Yeah, I think this conversation, I was hoping it would go beyond just new construction, because I do see that barrier as well in terms of financing available, or the financing pool availability on programs more broadly. Now, I know that some of the municipalities in Alberta were actually looking at using their existing banks and lines of credit to be able to fund their programs. And this was in the smaller towns where, the volumes weren't quite as large, but I know there was interest in other more traditional sources of financing for this. It's when FCM came by with a very, very attractive financing that I think it really, pulled a lot of attention, and in a good way, because that really, I think, enabled us to get off to a good start with these current programs. And I mean, when we were building an Energy Efficiency Alberta, sometimes we'd look at it and say, oh, how many people are going to want to participate in this, because it is more complex than an incentive program. So really good to kickstart it off with a very good start, and an attractive start like we've heard. Now, where do we go from here? Certainly, increasing that pool that's available, making the accessibility of it, increasing the accessibility of it, I think will be important. The federal government certainly has a lot of ambition around this, and does have some dollars allocated to reducing emissions. And so, going and having a conversation about increasing that pool available for existing projects as well, I think is very complementary to what I'm talking about. I haven't heard that we've hit a limit in terms of dollars available through that pathway, and so I do think it is one that's worth pursuing. I do hope that at some point we get to a place where the federal government says, well, we can't be doing this all by ourselves, because we've got so much demand, not just in this type of program, but other programs, and that we actually look at how do we leverage more private sector capital into this area. So municipalities, again, can go to the private sector and access this capital. It's not quite the same rates as FCM, but should we be thinking about how some of those FCM or federal government or government dollars can be used to help leverage a greater private investment in a very attractive way? So something like a loan loss reserve, where the government isn't necessarily putting in all the money, but they're saying, hey, we're going to make this lower risk for the private sector. So the private sector can come in and say, well, instead of our standard interest rate, because you've managed some of our risk, we're going to come in with lower interest rates than we have previously. And we saw that in a program that we were putting together at Energy Efficiency Alberta, excuse me, where we were doing a loan guarantee. And the loan guarantee actually enabled the private sector financing to, I think it was, bring down their financing rate by 3 or 4 times. And the value of the reduced interest rates from private sector was actually bigger than the amount of skin that that we were going to be putting in the game from a provincial agency perspective. So I do think there are opportunities to, think about how do we get to that next level, go to the provincial, go to government, get some more dollars, but also talk about how do we, leverage private sector in a very, again, attractive way from an interest rate perspective.
Fantastic. And so maybe I'll just follow that up with a quick question. Could you share a little bit about what the interest rates are in Alberta with the SEAT programming and sort of how those were set?
Yeah, no, good question. So I don't know all of them off the top of my head. I know there is a variety of them. The one that's coming to mind, I believe, is Rocky Mountain House. I think they had their 1% finance or 1% interest rates available through FCM for a portion of the loan. I think it came out to 69%, a very precise number. I'm not sure why it was such a precise number, but 69% of the loan could be at 1%. And then the remainder would be at the Alberta Treasury branch prime rate plus 1%. So that'd be a variable rate on the remainder of the loan. But certainly when you look at a loan that might stretch over 15 or 20 years, I mean, that's very attractive. I mean, I don't see anybody getting, 69% of their loan at a fixed 1% over 15 to 20 years. So I think that's certainly when it comes to incenting and supporting deep emission reduction projects. I do think that's still where we're at in terms of really encouraging people to go beyond just those simple upgrades, but to go to deep. And that's where the Canadian Infrastructure Bank is at right now as well. So it's a different program, different target market, but they're coming in at 1% if you get to, I believe it's 70 or 75% emission reductions on your project. And so again, these deep emission reduction projects, it looks like 1% over a long period of time is kind of where we're at the starting point. And deep emission reductions are not mainstream yet. They're still early days, and I do think that type of support is needed if we're going to be really trying to get the marketplace to be thinking about these deeper emission reduction projects.
Fantastic. So what you can't see in the background is we have a whole bunch of people answering questions in the question and answer. Yeah, so this is fantastic.
So,
and Stephanie,
let me know if someone totally disagreed with me.
Definitely. So Stephanie actually just posted in the chat some of the different ranges of interest rates that are being offered, and it sounds like it differs by municipality. So I would just maybe say if you want more want more details on that, then you can check out the MySEEP webpage, and you can always talk to that team over there. So I think something of interest happened today, and Jesse, I hope you have some context on this. I'm going to ask the question, but feel free to say I don't know much about it. So CMHC introduced the $40,000 loans that Canadian homeowners can access, and they are no interest loans. So could you offer a bit of juxtaposition of the two and why one might be of benefit over the other?
Oh, it's a fantastic question, and I've been waiting for them to come out with that program because that's a long time. I didn't realize it was today, so
yeah, this morning.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this when the government announced that they were going to be funding this efficiency financing through FCM and have CMHC do a loan program as well. I thought, boy, we are getting a little bit crowded in this space, and I'll have to look at it to see how it compares to the SEEP or the PACE offerings. But one of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about how the two will fit is that I think it's a good thing that the marketplace has more than one option to be able to go to explore what's a good fit for them. And so the CMHC loan might be a great fit for some folks, whereas other folks might say, well, actually this property type financing thing is better for me, because the question of, how long am I going to own this property is a bigger barrier for me. And so the property type financing is a fit for me, whereas we know property type financing isn't a fit for everybody. And so we know that PACE is only going to serve a portion of the marketplace. And so I think it's a good thing that we've got more than one new mechanism out there to help really encourage people to undertake these retrofits. And we got to keep in mind, we're still really early days when it comes to getting people to deep energy retrofits. It's like when the car first came out, there were dozens of different car companies. And over time, there was a consolidation, and we got a smaller number of car companies because there was economies of scale that were reached. Some of them didn't work out so well, but that's okay, because early on in a marketplace, it's actually really good to see a lot of dynamic innovation happening. And I do hope we get to a place where, it's very mature and we know exactly how the market's going to react and exactly how to move them to zero emissions. But let's be honest, we don't know that yet. And so trying a number of different things is not a bad thing.
Yeah, definitely. And Cindy's adding a couple comments in the chat as well about the different requirements for CMHC loans too. So thanks, Cindy, always helpful. Yeah, and it is very tied to the energy audits. I've heard some interesting things already about it, so it may not be quite as accessible. And so, I think that's a good lead into maybe our last question is, how can we increase the accessibility of PACE loans for municipalities? I heard you talk about municipalities, the legislation, the bylaws. How can we either create streamlined approaches or just, like I said, ease access for the municipalities?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good question. And I have heard that even already, the municipalities that are in the second or third wave are doing things quicker than the first wave. Certainly at Energy Efficiency Alberta, we were working for years and years just to get that first program out. And now a lot of the other programs can look at, or municipalities can look at the bylaws that have already been put out, the program rules that have already been put out, and almost a pick and choose menu to say, well, which version do we want to do? Do we want to tweak it at all? So I do see some of that ease of accessibility already happening. In terms of, how do we get even further? I do think that the financing and where we're going to access the money from is a really good question that I think there's been some speeding up of that from what I've heard through the FCM process as well. But how do we potentially even get to that next level is certainly a conversation that is going to be important. And again, on the new construction as well as the existing building side of things. So I don't have all of the answers, but I do think that it is a really important conversation to continue to have. And that actually, before we close out, is my last reminder that I do want to hear from you through the email address to see if you're interested in this conversation. We really can't have an effective conversation nationally or with the federal government or with national bodies unless we hear interest from other municipalities, other regions of the country. Just going and saying, hey, I've got some home builders and municipalities that are potentially interested in Alberta isn't enough for a national conversation. So please just send me an email, because that's the most important thing for me today.
Awesome. Okay. And with that, we are at 10:45. Thank you so much, Jesse. That was fabulous. And I know there's lots of questions we didn't get to, and I apologize if we did not get to your questions, but the contact information is right there. So send Jesse an email, send the SEEP team an email at the MySEEP website. I'm sure they would be more than happy to address your questions. And lastly, thank you so much for joining us today. We do record these, so this will be available on the website in probably the next week or so. So keep an eye out, and thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.